The hallway exploded into motion before a single alarm even sounded. It happened just like that. 1 second of normal silence. The highly specific, low-frequency hum and measured footsteps of a hospital in the dead of night. And the exact next second, a gurney violently crashing out of the VIP wing. It was moving at a speed that absolutely wasn't routine transport, flanked by 3 people wearing that terrifying, dead-eyed expression healthcare workers get when their training completely hijacks their bodies while their minds try to process the nightmare unfolding in front of them. The woman sprinting behind the gurney had her hair half undone from an evening that had started as a perfectly normal visit to her husband, who was admitted for a routine procedure. She was running with that frantic, desperate sprint of someone who isn't an athlete, but just found a gear she never knew she had. Choking on violent sobs that didn't ask for permission to escape, her arms desperately reaching out toward a gurney that was moving way too fast to catch. The cardiac monitors were screaming that specific, high-pitched, rapid-fire tone they only make when they are reporting something catastrophically wrong. The ICU swallowed the gurney with that ruthless emergency room efficiency that only exists when the people involved have bled through 1,000 simulations just for this exact moment. Nurses violently maneuvering the bed into place, the attending physician sprinting in while shoving his arms into his white coat, IV bags and crash carts being ripped open with the frantic anticipation of a crew that doesn't know exactly what they are going to need yet, but knows they are going to need a miracle. The man on the bed was seizing. His body was locked in a terrifying, unnatural rigidity that had nothing to do with muscle cramps. It was the violent seizing of a central nervous system that just took a massive hit it couldn't process, looping the fatal error code over and over again. His eyes were rolled completely back into his skull, exposing only the whites, and thick foam gathered at the corners of his mouth. It carried a highly specific visual signature that the doctors instantly recognized. This was absolutely not an epileptic seizure. It was triggered by a completely different monster that every single doctor in that room was desperately hunting for and completely failing to find. The cardiac monitor began to crash. It wasn't the erratic, jagged spiking of fibrillation. It was the slow, agonizing, progressive crawl of a system being violently suppressed. A heart that was actively losing the electrical signal keeping it alive, drawing that slow, downward curve on the screen that is, to anyone trained to read it, the most terrifying line a monitor can ever draw. Pressure is bottoming out. The attending's voice carried that razor-sharp clinical urgency, not blind panic, but the suffocating urgency that exists completely inside the lines of professional control. It is the most horrifying tone to hear, because it communicates that the nightmare is absolutely real, and nobody is overreacting. I have no idea what's hitting him. The tox screens are completely clean. If this is a poisoning, we cannot push an antidote if we don't know what the hell the toxin is. The wife had been physically stopped at the double doors by a massive nurse with gentle, unyielding firmness. The kind of firmness that silently communicates that her deep, shattering love for the man bleeding out on that bed was exactly why she had to stay in the hallway. That there were brutal, ugly things that needed to happen in that room that had absolutely no place for a grieving wife to witness. She stayed glued to the door, her trembling hands pressed flat against the glass. And on the exact opposite side of the hallway, standing at a distance that wasn't the lingering proximity of a rubbernecker, but the highly calculated angle of an operator finding the perfect vantage point, stood a man who was absolutely not looking at the patient's face. 40 years old, built with the kind of dense, functional muscle that radiates lethal force without ever needing to flex it. His head shaved close with that utilitarian buzz cut that has nothing to do with vanity, and everything to do with a guy who hates distractions. And the tattoos, ink that bled from his wrists, coiled up his forearms, wrapped around his biceps and choked his neck. The heavy, saturated coverage of a man who had chosen his own skin as a war journal over decades. Intricately scaled dragons warring with blooming lotus flowers, wrapped around deeply encrypted symbols that carried dark, heavy histories underneath them that nobody in this building had ever dared to ask about. The faded blue orderly uniform had the hospital's elite crest stitched over the left breast pocket. But that man's eyes were dead-locked on the IV bags, on the specific discoloration of the fluids, on the panicked, helpless expressions of the attending physicians as they threw darts in the dark and mist. He was reading the highly specific, violent pattern of the seizure through the glass with the ice-cold focus of a man who had seen this exact nightmare before. And in that ticking second, a hypothesis was locking into place in his brain that was way beyond a guess. It was a confirmed kill. His calloused hand slid into his pocket, His fingers found the small, beat-up black notebook and the heavy fountain pen that had written in that exact pocket for every single shift over the last few years. They were as much a part of his uniform as the corporate logo, except the logo had been issued by the machine, and the notebook had been chosen by the man. He took one heavy step toward the sliding glass doors. The restricted access sign hovered right at eye level, stark white with bleeding red letters, radiating the arrogant authority of a sign built to be blindly obeyed. But to understand exactly who this man was, what was buried inside that black notebook, and what was burning in those eyes that read IV drips the way normal people read faces, we need to step out of the ICU and rewind the clock a few hours. We need to go back to the start of a shift that kicked off like any other grinding day, but rapidly mutated into the exact moment where everything he had kept violently suppressed finally found its target. St. Jude's Elite Medical Center had been constructed with the kind of obscene blank check capital that fundamentally rewrites not just the architecture, but the entire vocabulary of a building. The hallways were massive and washed in warm, ambient light that looked nothing like a sterile clinic. The recovery rooms were literal penthouse suites. The ground floor bistro served plates that rivaled Michelin-starred restaurants. It was a fortress engineered exclusively for the 1%, a place where the horrifying reality of getting sick could be, if not pleasant, at least aesthetically flawless. The chief administrator was a man named Dr. Harrison Vance, and he had clawed his way to the top of the food chain through a lethal combination of genuine corporate ruthlessness and the highly specific predatory talent of navigating rooms full of old money. He had the fluency of a guy born knowing the game existed and exactly how to rig it. 55 years old, wearing bespoke Italian suits perfectly tailored for every occasion, draped in a crisp white lab coat that served a dual, manipulative purpose, broadcasting unquestionable medical authority while simultaneously flexing his absolute corporate dominance. Vance strutted down the corridors of St. Jude's Elite, exactly like a billionaire pacing his own living room. There was a specific, arrogant quality to his stride that is impossible to describe without using the exact right word, which is peacocking, not just as a cheap insult, but in the literal biological sense of an animal that has learned that aggressively displaying its feathers is half the battle. He understood that posture asserts dominance long before a single syllable leaves the throat. He greeted the VIP patients by their first names, flawlessly recalled their spouses and sometimes their kids, wielding that terrifying sociopathic charisma that makes a target feel like the only human being on Earth for exactly 30 seconds. It's a terrifyingly effective weapon, regardless of how maliciously it's deployed. The staff, however, existed in a completely different dimension. It wasn't active, screaming cruelty. It was the highly structured sociopathic indifference of a guy who had mentally segregated the universe into people who elevate the brand and tools used to polish the brand. The top-tier surgeons existed in the first bucket. The nursing staff, depending on the day, hovered on the edge. The orderlies, the janitorial crew, the support grunts, they were permanently buried in the second bucket. And it wasn't a bucket built on hatred. It was a bucket built on total, dehumanizing absence. They were invisible the exact same way the waiting room chairs were invisible. That morning, Vance had been executing his rounds with the ruthless efficiency he had perfected over the years, auditing the floor, flashing million-dollar smiles at the right wallets, mentally logging which department heads needed to be chewed out later. He had just turned the corner into the post-op recovery wing when he saw the scene. A burly orderly was sitting right next to the bed of an elderly female patient. He wasn't standing at attention. He wasn't projecting the rigid posture of a grunt executing a task. He was sitting down, leaning in close, his massive, heavily tattooed hands gently wrapped around the fragile, wrinkled hand of the old woman, with a heartbreaking tenderness that carried the specific authenticity of an act done entirely without an audience in mind. The patient's eyes were closed, but there was a deep, unshakable peace radiating from her face that absolutely hadn't been there when Vance toured the wing yesterday. The orderly was whispering to her softly. Vance aggressively wrinkled his nose. He froze in the hallway and stared at the interaction for a few seconds, running the cold, calculated algorithm he had been heavily trained to run, not evaluating the profound quality of the human care, but strictly auditing the optics. What a deep-pocketed visitor would see. What a billionaire family member would think walking through that door. And exactly what kind of brand damage St. Jude's Elite would suffer when a high-net-worth client found a guy sitting next to their mother's bed, with his neck and arms choked in violently colored tattoos, bleeding from blood red to cobalt blue ink. After a few ticking seconds, he snapped his fingers and dragged the floor's nursing supervisor out into the hall. "Who the hell is that?" The tone wasn't a question. It was the lethal confirmation of a guilty verdict that had already been signed. The tattooed thug. "What is he doing lingering in my recovery suite?" The supervisor nervously swallowed and explained that it was Luke, the morning shift orderly. He explained that Luke had stayed by the woman's side to keep her calm while they waited for transport clearance, and that he was famous on the floor for having a remarkably calming presence with the most terrified, high-risk patients. "A wealthy family is going to walk in here and think we let a cartel enforcer onto the floor." Vance delivered the line with the chilling, dead-eyed cadence of a CEO running a corporate risk assessment. "A biker gang reject, an ex-con, I don't give a damn. This is an elite world-class medical fortress. It is absolutely not a halfway house for guys who look like that. It projects a disgustingly cheap image to people paying a premium to be here." The supervisor actually tried to fight back. He practically begged, explaining that Luke had bled for that hospital for 4 years without a single write-up. He pushed back, stating that VIP patients literally requested him by name, and that just 2 weeks ago, a massive donor family had written a glowing letter to the board, specifically praising the tattooed orderly, who sat with their dying father through the darkest hours of the night. Vance let him finish. "Fire him." The 2 words dropped from his mouth with a terminal corporate finality that completely suffocated any room for debate. It wasn't presented as a talking point. It was a lethal command waiting for execution. His aesthetic is violently incompatible with the St. Jude's standard. If he's such a bleeding heart saint, he can go find a job at some filthy public clinic that actually tolerates his kind of garbage. The supervisor walked back onto the floor, looking like a man who had just been handed a loaded gun and an order he knew was deeply evil, but absolutely lacked the spine or the power to disobey. Luke was pulled into the office at the end of his shift. He took the bullet with the terrifying, armored calm that a man develops when this is far from the first time the world has violently decided his skin ink is more important than his soul. A dead calm that isn't apathy. It's the hardened, tactical byproduct of a lifetime spent refusing to give bigots the explosive, angry reaction they are desperately hoping to provoke. He calmly pulled the black notebook from his chest pocket. He jotted down a single line. He slipped it back into his scrubs, and he quietly asked the sweating supervisor if he could please finish out his last 30 minutes, because there was a backlogged transport ticket, and the terrified old woman in room 16 had explicitly asked him to come back and say goodbye before she was discharged. He went back and said goodbye. It is genuinely sickening to believe that a hospital, a fortress literally built to preserve human life, would terminate the single most compassionate soul in the building just because some arrogant suit didn't like the ink on his arms. If you feel the toxic heat of this injustice burning in your gut, crush that like button right now to prove you're riding with Luke. Because the tattooed thug, who had just been thrown out like trash for ruining the elite aesthetic of St. Jude's, was now, just a few hours later, standing completely still in the ICU hallway, his scarred hand resting on his notebook, his dark eyes locked onto the IV bags, flawlessly diagnosing a catastrophic medical crisis that the highest-paid doctors in the city were utterly failing to solve. And buried inside that little black notebook was the exact weapon they needed. Written in ink was the literal difference between that cardiac monitor crashing down into a flatline and clawing its way back up into the steady beating rhythm of a man who gets to live another day. Luke took his second heavy step toward the ICU doors. The restricted access sign screamed at him. He shoved the double doors open. The HR department at St. Jude's Elite was buried on a floor the VIP patients never saw. It was the corporate purgatory level, choked with cheap gray carpet and buzzing fluorescent lights that had absolutely not received the multi-million-dollar aesthetic budget of the clinical floors above. This was the windowless bunker where the ugly gears of the machine grinded away without needing to look pretty. Filing cabinets, windowless conference rooms, and the cold, sanitized assassinations that hospitals conduct internally that never make the glossy PR brochures. Luke had walked into the cramped office at exactly 4:42 p.m. The HR analyst was a 35-year-old woman who had spent her career aggressively training herself to sever her empathy from her corporate execution orders. But today, she was actively struggling to maintain the firewall, because the file sitting on her desk made the execution feel sickeningly wrong. The personnel dossier was practically glowing. A flawless 4-year service record without a single write-up, 2 glowing letters of profound gratitude for mourning families, and performance reviews that consistently shattered the institutional average. And the official justification for his termination was exactly what it was. Total garbage. She read the severance terms using her heavily practiced robotic HR voice. Dead flat, crystal clear, aggressively stripped of any inflection that could possibly be weaponized in a wrongful termination suit. Incompatibility with corporate brand imaging. Fundamental failure to align with the aesthetic expectations of our target demographic. The slick, soulless legal jargon engineered to mask the ugly bigotry the document refused to say out loud. Luke took the execution without interrupting a single word. When she finally stopped talking, there was a suffocating 1-second void. It was the exact gap she had learned to recognize as the moment the target decides whether they are going to scream, cry, or flip the desk. But the silence radiating off Luke possessed a chilling frequency she had never encountered before. It wasn't the trembling, suppressed rage she knew how to de-escalate. It wasn't the tearful breakdown she knew how to manage with a tissue box. It was something entirely different that took her brain a full minute to accurately name. It was the total absence of surprise. It wasn't the pathetic surrender of a broken man accepting an injustice because he was too weak to fight. It was the chilling, armored non-reaction of an operator who had seen this exact ambush 1,000 times before. A man who had learned the hard way that the world has a very specific bigoted playbook, and it runs those plays so often that being surprised by it is a luxury a guy with ink on his neck can't afford. "Can I clear my locker out?" His voice was dead calm, carrying the grounded, tactical tone of a guy immediately shifting to logistical next steps. Because logistical next steps are all you have left when the universe robs you of answers. She gave a weak, pathetic nod. Luke walked out of the HR bunker with the exact same heavy, deliberate stride he used to walk in. Not dragging his feet, not stomping the carpet, not giving them a single ounce of the dramatic breakdown they were expecting. He took the freight elevator down to the basement locker room, popped open locker number 43, with the brass key he had carried for 4 years, and grabbed the heavy canvas jacket and tactical backpack inside. The black notebook had been riding in his breast pocket for the entire termination meeting. It was still tucked against his chest as he slammed the metal locker shut for the final time. He pulled it out, stared at the leather cover for a second with the look of a guy checking to make sure his weapon survived a blast, and shoved it into the quick-access outer pocket of his tactical bag. Not buried at the bottom, tucked right where he could draw it instantly. He had one last piece of data to log before he burned his bridge. He sat down on the wooden locker room bench, clicked his fountain pen open, and flipped to the next clean page. He wrote with that tiny, hyper-precise script, not words, but cold, hard medical data. A clinical observation he had locked onto 2 days ago during a routine transport. A patient who had presented with a highly erratic cocktail of symptoms. Symptoms that he had meticulously documented because he had seen something terrifyingly similar in a completely different blood-soaked lifetime, and his gut screamed at him to log the anomaly, even if he didn't fully have the diagnosis yet. He snapped the notebook shut, shoved it in the bag, and he walked out. The long, sterile corridor that funneled out to the parking garage cut right past the executive wing, and that was exactly where he ran head-on into Vance. The chief administrator had just swaggered out of a boardroom flanked by 2 senior surgeons, owning the hallway with the arrogant posture of a king who just signed a death warrant and completely forgot about the corpse. His cold eyes locked onto Luke, the disgraced orderly with a backpack slung over his massive shoulders, still wearing the blue scrubs because he hadn't bothered to change, the St. Jude's Elite logo still stitched over his heart. Vance stared at him. It wasn't the long, challenging glare of an alpha male looking for a fight. It was a 1-second sweeping visual audit that acted as a final execution, a look that evaluates, judges, and permanently deletes you in the same microsecond. Then, Vance violently snapped his head away, deploying that dismissive chin-up gesture that is infinitely more insulting than a glare, because a glare at least respects the fact that you are a physical threat. Luke stopped walking for 1 ticking second. He stared at Vance with dark, dead calm eyes that had spent 4 years in this building, quietly analyzing the predators, eyes trained over a lifetime of being violently judged before ever being heard. There was something burning in Luke's stare that Vance was too arrogant to look long enough to catch. A dangerous sub-zero glint that wasn't petty anger, and sure as hell wasn't sadness. It was something vastly more surgical. It was the look of an operator running a threat assessment and filing the target's face away for a reckoning that was going to survive long after this hallway encounter ended. Then Luke shifted his backpack and kept walking. He hit the main exit, He shoved his massive, ink-covered hand against the heavy revolving glass door and stepped out into the concrete parking structure where the late afternoon sun was still radiating heat. He stood perfectly still on the hot asphalt for a minute. That was the exact second the ambulance came screaming into the bay. The wail hit him before he saw the rig. Not the lazy, generic siren of a routine transport, but the hyper-aggressive, deafening blast of a paramedic leaning on the horn, screaming at the world that they are actively losing a life, and the traffic needs to part right now. The rig tore up the emergency ramp and slammed the brakes in the bay with that violent, controlled skid that represents the absolute maximum speed you can drive without killing the patient in the back. Luke didn't move an inch, backpack strapped tight, the revolving glass doors of the hospital 30 feet behind him, standing in a sea of luxury cars while the afternoon rolled on, completely indifferent to the human tragedy unfolding on the concrete. He watched them rip the gurney out of the back doors. There was roughly 100 feet between him and the trauma bay, but the sun was blinding and the angle was dead perfect. It was more than enough distance for Luke's eyes to lock onto exactly what they had been heavily trained to hunt for: the horrifying asymmetrical pattern of the seizure, the unnatural arch of the victim's spine, the sickly, specific discoloration blooming across the face, the violent, jagged quality of the involuntary muscle spasms as the central nervous system redlined just millimeters away from total collapse. He had seen that exact nightmare before. Not in this sterile hospital. In a completely different, blood-soaked universe years ago. In a nightmare he had transcribed into the black notebook because the horrors he witnessed that didn't have an immediate medical textbook diagnosis always went into the book, where they sat in the dark, waiting for the day the enemy finally showed its face again. The enemy was showing its face right now. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass of the ER bay, he could clearly see Vance. The chief administrator had instantly recognized the VIP bleeding out on the gurney, and the arrogant, peacocking swagger was completely gone. He was moving with a panicked, frantic urgency, his white coat flying as he sprinted down the hallway toward the ICU, moving with the terrified speed of a corporate suit who suddenly realizes there are violent, ugly situations in this world where brand management is completely useless and people actually die. The ICU turned into a slaughterhouse. Luke knew it without even having to step inside. He had spent 4 years in that fortress, and he knew the exact acoustic frequency the building emitted when a code blue was going off the rails. Those desperate, screaming sounds were bleeding through the double-paned glass and hitting him in the parking lot with crystal clarity. The on-call toxicologist had been paged. Luke got the intel a minute later when his burner phone buzzed. A text from a grunt still on shift inside, firing off a message with the frantic speed of a guy sharing gossip that is way too radioactive to keep quiet. The top-tier toxicologist was completely blind to the pattern. The ICU gods were throwing darts at the wall and missing the toxin. The VIP was actively crashing, and Vance was locked inside that ICU, screaming demands that Luke couldn't hear, but could accurately predict down to the syllable. He had heard that specific frequency of the boss's voice enough times to know exactly how ugly it got when the pressure finally cracked his spine. We have to freeze the clock right here and deeply recognize the cosmic joke playing out on this concrete. The arrogant suit who had just fired Luke over his appearance, who had weaponized words like brand, elite, and intimidating to throw a dedicated, compassionate professional into the gutter, was now trapped inside a glass box, watching his prestige, his Ivy League doctors, and his million-dollar hospital completely fail to save a VIP he claimed was worth more than the entire building. And the absolute only human being on Earth who had recognized the fatal seizure pattern was standing in the parking lot with a backpack on, holding a termination slip he had been handed 2 hours ago. If you feel the crushing weight of this irony, crush that like button right now to show you are riding with Luke. Luke stood dead still, staring at the glass fortress. His pack was strapped tight. The notebook was sitting in the quick-draw pocket. The sun was bleeding out into the horizon. There was a massive choice to be made. Not the agonizing, conflicted choice of a guy weighing his pride, but the hyper-lethal decision that had already been authorized by his gut, long before his conscious brain caught up. The choice had been locked in the exact microsecond his eyes recognized the kill pattern on the gurney, and his body was already arming the weapon before his mind finished writing the order. There was a human being violently seizing in an ICU. There was a phantom toxin tearing him apart that the doctors were utterly blind to. And there was a beat-up black notebook carrying a clinical profile written 48 hours ago by a tattooed orderly. an orderly who had been thrown in the trash for broadcasting a repulsive image to the billionaires who paid a fortune to breathe the air inside St. Jude's Elite. Luke pivoted on his heel. He marched straight back to the revolving glass doors. He shoved the glass panel with his ink-stained palm, the exact same hand, the exact same heavy motion from a few hours ago, just reversing the trajectory, and he walked back into the fire. Luke stepped through the revolving doors with the tactical bag still strapped to his back. He hadn't bothered to hit the locker room to strip off his scrubs. The faded blue uniform with the St. Jude's crest was still on his back, and there was something deeply terrifying in that minor detail, for anyone smart enough to read the room. The terminated orderly had marched back in still wearing the colors, not because the job still existed, but because his body simply hadn't found the time to transition out of war mode. He knew the maze of corridors leading to the ICU purely by muscle memory. He had walked that exact route 1,000 times over 4 years, dragging gurneys both ways, through absolute boredom and screaming emergencies. The hospital had a different acoustic footprint in the late afternoon than it did in the morning, which was entirely different from the graveyard shift, and Luke had absorbed all of those frequencies the way a veteran absorbs the sounds of a jungle, not consciously, but downloaded straight into the nervous system, recording ambient data without being asked. The noise bleeding out of the ICU hallway was the frantic, terrifying sound of blind panic. He hit the double doors before his brain completely finalized the rules of engagement. He was there simply because he had recognized the kill pattern, and in his world, recognizing the pattern forged a blood oath obligation that didn't require a debate. It existed in the exact same primal space as the obligation to catch a falling man when you were standing close enough to grab his shirt. Staring through the reinforced glass of the ICU doors, Luke's eyes ran the exact same diagnostic scan they had run in the parking lot, but this time with high-definition proximity. The victim's pupils were violently pinned. Not the natural physiological constriction to bright lights, but a terrifying pinpoint collapse. It was a severe meiosis that completely bypassed normal biology, screaming that a foreign agent had forcefully hijacked the system and pushed it way past the red line. The skin tone was radiating a sickening, highly specific hue that wasn't the pale white of hemorrhagic shock, and it wasn't the suffocating blue of hypoxia. It was a terrifying hybrid of the two, triggered by a completely different monster. And the violent mechanical rhythm of the seizure, the rigid lock, the micro-release, the brutal lock again, pounding out a highly specific frequency. There was a clinical note buried in his notebook, jotted down 2 days ago after a transport, documenting a patient who had crashed with bizarre symptoms that had triggered Luke's radar for reasons the notebook was now confirming, with lethal accuracy. Luke shoved the door open. He walked in. Nobody even noticed the breach. There was way too much blood in the water, too many bodies frantically moving, too many monitors screaming, and too many doctors desperately trying to kill the noise. He planted his boots 6 feet from the bed. His dark eyes aggressively swept the hanging IV bags, the scattered vials on the crash cart, and the erratic vitals crashing on the digital monitor. It wasn't the slow, textbook evaluation of an attending physician. It was the brutal, diagonal speed read of a trauma operator who had hauled enough bleeding bodies to instantly recognize the nightmare before he even had the time to label the individual pieces. The 3 seconds he stood there staring were the seconds of the kill math. Not a conscious verbalized checklist, but the instantaneous background processing that takes the raw visual data as input and spits out. Not a wild guess, but an absolute titanium certainty. The kind of certainty that doesn't need a second opinion because the puzzle is already solved. It's tetrazoline. The voice sliced through the screaming room with the exact same dead calm frequency he had carried all afternoon. The terrifying sub-zero calm that isn't performative, but the direct byproduct of a man who knows exactly what he is looking at and doesn't need to scream to make the facts true. The words hit the chaotic air of the ICU with that jarring, heavy impact that words have when they are fired into a room that absolutely did not expect to hear them. A few panicked faces whipped around. Massive overdose of eye drops. He likely ingested an entire bottle, possibly more. Tetrazoline in a high enough concentration triggers this exact violent profile. Pinpoint meiosis, progressive bradycardia, and an atypical seizure loop. A brutal pause that had absolutely nothing to do with hesitation. It was pure, clinical precision. You need to push flumazenil and get him on heavy ventilatory support right now, and you need to aggressively monitor for secondary respiratory depression. The dead silence that swallowed the room lasted less than 3 seconds. The on-call toxicologist physically spun his entire body around. He was a 45-year-old specialist in a pristine white coat, his glasses slipping down his sweating nose after an hour of absolute hell. He wore the furious, exhausted expression of a top-tier expert who had just thrown his entire medical arsenal at a wall and watched it all bounce off. He was simmering in a toxic cocktail of fatigue and shattered ego, making the diagnosis he just heard infinitely harder to swallow, both because of what it was and because of the garbage who had just said it. His eyes aggressively raked Luke from head to toe, the faded blue scrubs, the tactical backpack still strapped to his chest, the heavy ink crawling up his throat, the massive tattooed biceps exposed under the short sleeves, covered in the violent colors that had gotten him fired just hours ago. The toxicologist barked a laugh. It wasn't a genuine laugh. It was a short, bitter, frantic scoff. The pathetic sound a fragile ego makes when it violently rejects a piece of data before the brain even tries to process it. "Get the hell out of here, orderly." His voice dripped with that sickening, condescending arrogance that is infinitely worse than a scream. He didn't raise his voice because he didn't need to. He honestly believed his Ivy League degree gave him the right to crush the peasant with a whisper. "Tetrazoline? That is completely absurd. Vicine doesn't cause systemic crash profiles in adult males. Go read a goddamn textbook before you ever walk into my ICU again." Vance came charging out from the back of the trauma bay. He recognized Luke with the terrifying speed that only happens when you just fired a man a few hours ago, and his face is still fresh in the crosshairs. Vance's expression instantly mutated from the sheer terror of losing a VIP patient into a completely different kind of crisis. The violent animal urgency of an alpha male, whose absolute authority is being threatened in front of his staff. For a guy like Vance, crushing a peasant is as instinctual as breathing. "You piece of trash." His voice was a low, lethal hiss loaded with the toxic rage of a man who finally found a punching bag he could legally destroy in the middle of a disaster he couldn't control. "Didn't I just terminate you? What the hell are you doing in here? Get out of my sight before I have security drag you out in handcuffs." Luke stared dead into the director's eyes. There was a look burning in Luke's eyes in that exact moment that is almost impossible to describe without insulting it. It wasn't anger. It wasn't the pathetic resignation of a guy whose feelings were hurt by the insults. It was something infinitely colder. It was the face of an operator running one final internal diagnostic check, confirming that he had correctly identified the enemy, and silently prepping his body to execute the mission, regardless of the crossfire. He took one step back. It wasn't the retreating step of a defeated man. It was the tactical pivot of an operator who just ran the math and realized that getting into a physical brawl with the director would burn seconds the dying patient absolutely did not have. He knew there was a backdoor. There is always a backdoor for a guy who knows the architecture of the battlefield better than the generals. He walked out of the ICU. He stood dead still right outside the sliding glass doors. And he waited. The minutes that ticked by carried that suffocating radioactive weight that time only gets when it becomes a countdown. Not the slow, boring drag of a waiting room, but the violent, objective reality of sand pouring through an hourglass, knowing every second that drops is a second of a man's life bleeding out on the floor. Luke could hear the carnage through the glass. The Ivy League gods had emptied their entire magazine. He heard the panicked orders barking across the room, recognized the sterile textbook protocols they were desperately running through, and mentally calculated the catastrophic failure of every single attempt before the flatlining results even hit the monitors. The protocol was failing, not because the doctors were stupid. They were highly competent within the safe padded walls of their textbooks. The protocol was failing because it was built for standard, predictable poisons. Tetrazoline wasn't on the cartel's hit list because it's a cheap, over-the-counter eye drop. It's an aisle 3 pharmacy product. Nobody assassinates a billionaire with Vicine in the shiny, predictable world those medical textbooks were written for. The cardiac monitor abruptly changed its pitch. Luke recognized the terrifying drone before he even looked at the screen. It's the haunting, specific wail a monitor makes when the human heart completely surrenders its natural electrical rhythm and blindly submits to the toxic frequency the poison is forcing down its throat. A frequency that is completely, biologically incompatible with staying alive. Full cardiopulmonary arrest. Code Blue. Inside the glass box, the doctors violently pivoted into the resuscitation protocol with the robotic, panicked muscle memory of men who have run out of ideas chest compressions pounding at the exact tempo, the ambu bag desperately forcing air, the defibrillator paddles charging with a high-pitched whine. The arrogant toxicologist had backed into the corner, his white coat suddenly looking very heavy, wearing the horrified, sickening expression of a man who is slowly processing the reality that he might have just committed manslaughter by ego, but desperately fighting the conclusion because the lawsuits would destroy his life. Vance stood paralyzed dead center in the ICU. There was something radiating off the director in that moment that was radically different from the arrogant suit who had strutted through the halls all afternoon. The PR panic was gone. The executive rage was gone. The toxic dominance that had targeted Luke was completely vaporized. It was replaced by the oldest, purest, most pathetic terror on Earth. The sheer, unadulterated horror of a man watching a human life evaporate on a bed while standing 3 feet away, entirely powerless to stop it. A ghostly, sickening pallor had drained every ounce of blood from Vance's face, entirely bypassing normal fear. It was the face of a guy watching his entire career, his elite reputation, and his golden parachute violently disintegrate into a flatlining green line on a monitor that absolutely should not be drawing a straight line. The heart refused to kick. They dumped a shock into his chest. Once, twice. The trauma surgeon hammered away at the chest compressions with the desperate, sweaty determination of a guy who refuses to call time of death as long as his arms still work. But the kinetic energy in the room was shifting into something dark and fatalistic. The crushing weight of the ticking clock, the mounting pile of failed interventions, the suffocating realization that the diagnosis they had banked on was fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. The digital clock on the ICU wall brutally ticked away the seconds with the psychopathic indifference of a machine. Luke stood right outside the glass doors, backpack strapped tight, notebook tucked in the outer pocket, his dark eyes burning into the flatlining monitor through the glass. He wore the terrifyingly still expression of a man trapped in the only space left in the universe when you hold the cure and absolutely nobody is listening to you. The purgatory of waiting. And it wasn't passive. It was the most violently active form of presence imaginable, holding your ground when they lock the doors, standing ready to be the salvation the exact second someone in that room finally swallows their pride and asks the right question. The trauma surgeon running the code ripped his eyes away from the dying chest and looked at the toxicologist. There was something in that violent head snap that completely bypassed hospital protocol. It was a screaming, desperate question that didn't need to be spoken out loud, because it was bleeding all over his sweaty face. The toxicologist stared at the flatlining monitor. He stared at the corpse on the bed. He stared at the graveyard of empty vials on the crash cart that had done absolutely nothing to stop the bleeding. Then he slowly turned his head and looked at the glass doors. He stared at the massive tattooed man standing in the hallway with a backpack on, the peasant who had casually tossed a diagnosis into the room that had been arrogantly thrown in the trash before anyone even bothered to run the math. The ICU doors blew open for the second time that afternoon. This time there was absolutely zero hesitation in the breach. The decision had been finalized on the other side of the glass, the exact second the monitor flatlined. It was a choice authorized by the gut long before the brain finished writing the order, and the body was already moving into the kill zone before the ego could object. Luke marched in. The massive male nurse closest to the door took an instinctive, aggressive step forward to block the path. Luke slipped the block with a terrifyingly fluid shift of his weight. Not an aggressive shove, not a violent strike, just the hyper-efficient, ghostly movement of an operator who was heavily trained to ghost right through the enemy line when there are bodies between him and the target. He hit the side of the bed. The chest compressions were still pounding away. The trauma surgeon looked up, his face a twisted mask of a guy drowning in a failed protocol, who just got hit with a rogue variable the manual didn't prepare him for. His sweaty face broadcasted the frantic rhythm of the CPR, and a screaming, confused demand to know who the hell this massive guy was, and why he was marching into a sterile trauma bay with a lethal determination that looked absolutely nothing like a rubbernecker or a lost janitor. Luke didn't even look at the doctor. The tactical bag hit the floor in one smooth drop. His calloused hand slipped into the outer pocket and snatched the black notebook with the blind muscle memory of a gunfighter drawing a sidearm. The heavy fountain pen clicked out of his other pocket. He ripped the notebook open to the first blank page he found. Not the right page, not the pretty page, just the first available blank space, because a dying brain has zero time for aesthetics. And he wrote, "Not slowly." The tiny, meticulous handwriting from the locker room mutated into the violent, aggressive scrawl of an operator writing at blinding speed without sacrificing a single drop of medical precision. It is a highly specific, terrifying skill that is only forged when you practice precision under heavy enemy fire. The exact chemical compound slashed across the top line, the lethal dosage slashed right below it. Then, the secondary protocol. Then, the tertiary. He violently ripped the page out with a clean, perfect tear along the spiral binding. He shoved the paper directly into the chest of the clinical pharmacist, standing to the right of the bed, locking eyes with a guy who was currently short-circuiting, trying to process a rogue medical order coming from a guy in blue scrubs with neck tattoos, while the room burned down around them. Flumazenil, 0.5 milligrams, right goddamn now. The voice that tore out of Luke's throat was the terrifying, suppressed frequency he had kept buried all afternoon, finally surfacing with the effortless power of a monster taking off its leash. It wasn't the quiet voice of the orderly in the hallway. It was the voice of a man who had barked kill orders in blood-soaked war zones, where his command was the literal difference between a soldier going home or taking a body bag. And mix an activated charcoal slurry with PEG for immediate bowel irrigation. Move. The pharmacist stared at the ripped paper. The ICU plunged into that agonizing, terrifying microsecond that only happens in mass casualty events when the holy textbook protocol completely fails, and a rogue lifeline is thrown into the dark. The second where the sheer, suffocating gravity of the dying body actively overrides the corporate terror of breaking the rules. Where the desperate logic of trying a Hail Mary finally shatters the bureaucratic wall that was blocking the shot. The pharmacist scrambled for the crash cart. Vance had opened his mouth to scream an order, and just froze, his jaw hanging open like a dying fish. Totally silent, because the sheer gravitational dominance radiating off the tattooed orderly had completely paralyzed the arrogant corporate vocal cords that had been barking orders all day. The antidote hit the line. It was pushed into the IV with the silent, lethal efficiency of trauma junkies, who know exactly what they are doing. The nurse slamming the plunger, the exact dosage, the perfect vein, the perfect timing. The seconds that ticked by were the kind you don't measure in time, you measure in heartbeats. They exist purely as units of agonizing suspense, each ticking second carrying the explosive potential that the flatline would mutate into a spike, that the monitor would draw a different picture, that the fatal death spiral they had been trapped in would finally violently snap. The seizure violently flatlined. Not a slow fade, it was the brutal, night-and-day severance that only happens when the exact right chemical sniper bullet hits the exact right toxin before the window closes. The spine that had been locked in agonizing rigidity suddenly went slack with a totality that is, in itself, a terrifying medical indicator. Not the limp, heavy slack of a corpse, but the exhausted, system-wide collapse of a central nervous system that just got the memo that the cavalry had finally arrived. The cardiac monitor abruptly shifted its pitch. The chaotic, jagged flat line started hunting for a baseline, not all at once, but fighting its way back up the screen with the brutal, stubborn progression of a human heart, finally receiving the right electrical current. It's one of the most highly specific, beautiful sounds on Earth. A sound that trauma junkies recognize in their souls before they even look at the digital numbers. 60 beats per minute. 65. The patient took a breath, a massive, ragged, unassisted gasp of air. A desperate, shuddering breath violently ripped into the lungs by the patient's own body, carrying that profound, resurrecting quality of a dead engine suddenly catching a spark and roaring back to life. The silence that entombed the ICU was the heavy, suffocating silence of the aftermath. Not an empty void, but a radioactive silence packed with hysterical relief, unspoken horror, and the collective gut-rotting realization that they had just been millimeters away from a body bag that absolutely didn't need to happen. 70 beats. The monitor was happily painting a flawless, healthy sinus rhythm. The Ivy League toxicologist was paralyzed next to the stainless counter, his white coat feeling like a straitjacket, his glasses slipping down his nose. He wore the single most devastating expression a medical expert can ever wear. The shattered ego of a guy who has been at the top of his class his entire life, who just realized he confidently executed the wrong protocol, completely ignored the right diagnosis because he hated the guy who handed it to him, and was currently doing the horrifying math on exactly how many minutes of life his arrogant prejudice had almost cost that VIP. The question slipped out of his mouth with the raw, bleeding honesty of genuine defeat. Not a rhetorical jab, not a defensive counterattack. The desperate question of a man who literally doesn't know the answer and feels like he's going to die if he doesn't find out. "How did you know?" Luke casually slid the heavy fountain pen back into his pocket. He snapped the black notebook shut and dropped it back into the tactical bag with the exact same meticulous care he always used. The quiet, disciplined care he had carried through the locker room, the parking lot, and the hallway outside. He adjusted the collar of his faded blue scrubs with the calm, methodical gesture of an operator squaring away his gear before delivering the final payload. He stared at the toxicologist. Then he locked eyes with Vance. The chief administrator was frozen in a catatonic state that had slammed into him the exact second the antidote hit the line and the monitor spiked. It was the total paralysis of a corporate shark trying to process the catastrophic blast radius of the last 3 hours. Not just the medical code, not just the billionaire who almost died on his watch, but the entire ugly, bigoted chain of events that led to this exact second. A chain that included a termination slip handed out 2 hours ago. The words, thug, and intimidating, and elite brand image. And the horrifying reality that a tattooed grunt who had been thrown in the trash had kicked the door in anyway, to save a life that all the Ivy League degrees in the room were actively failing to save. Luke spoke. The voice that hit the room was absolutely not the voice of the quiet orderly pushing wheelchairs. It was something massive that had been uncaged from the dark, finding its exact target, and detonating with the effortless, terrifying natural power of a weapon that was simply waiting for the right war to be used in. Because I spent 12 years as a Special Forces combat medic, the silence in the room mutated into something lethal. I treated chemical poisonings in war zones that this boutique hotel will never even read about. I kept operators breathing after they took hits from black market compounds that don't exist in any civilian toxicology textbook on Earth, because half of those compounds were engineered specifically to bypass civilian medical infrastructure. A heavy pause that carried the crushing weight of those 12 years, the Black Ops missions, the bleeding brothers, the agonizing nights where his hands were the only barrier between a soldier going home or flying back in a flag-draped box. A massive tetrazoline overdose is documented in exactly 3 cases I worked in the field. 2 accidents, 1 assassination attempt. The physiological signature is highly specific. I learned how to hunt it. The toxicologist looked like he had stopped breathing. My ink. Luke aggressively shoved the short sleeve of his blue scrubs up his massive bicep, not a theatrical, showboating flex, but the blunt, functional gesture of a guy slapping the evidence on the table. Woven into his right forearm, buried between the bleeding lotus flowers and the coiled dragons, was a highly complex geometric pattern that was radically different from the rest of the art. It was a sprawling, hyper-detailed structure that any Tier 1 chemist or pharmacologist would instantly recognize as a molecular diagram, etched into his skin with a precision that was absolutely not decorative. That is the molecular chemical structure for the antidote to VX nerve gas. His dead eyes snapped back to Vance. It's not a gang sign. It's a survival map. Every single piece of ink choking my arms and my neck is a timestamp for a Black Ops deployment, a chemical weapon I learned how to kill, and a brother who didn't make it back to base. His voice stayed locked in that low, terrifying sub-zero register the entire time. 0 yelling, 0 theatrics, because the raw truth was infinitely heavier than a scream. Your aesthetic doesn't dictate my competence, Doctor. That final doctor was fired directly at Vance with the lethal surgical precision of a sniper bullet, using a title of respect as a devastating, emasculating insult. Vance's jaw was literally hanging open. His horrified eyes were glued to the heavy ink he had arrogantly dismissed as incompatible with the brand, the exact ink that had been the sole reason for a termination order just 2 hours ago. The ink that was now, bathed in the blinding light of the recovering VIP on the bed, and the staggering reality that a chemical antidote was literally tattooed on the arm of the guy he fired, revealed as something infinitely more profound and terrifying than his pathetic corporate brain could have ever imagined. The cardiac monitor kept happily pinging its flawless rhythm, 72 beats per minute, solid as a rock, the acoustic heartbeat of a man who had almost crossed over and was dragged violently back into the world of the living, entirely because a tattooed grunt who was fired for looking like trash had kicked the door down anyway, armed with a cheap notebook, a fountain pen, and 12 years of blood-soaked memories tattooed over a body that an arrogant bigot refused to look at closely enough to see. The suffocating silence that buried the ICU after Luke's speech carried that radioactive quality that only happens when a massive, ugly truth is finally spoken out loud, and the room is still actively absorbing the blast radius. It wasn't an empty void. It was a hyper-dense silence, choked with the crushing weight of what was just exposed, and the horrifying realization that it could never, ever be unsaid. Every single pair of eyes in the trauma bay slowly rotated to lock onto Vance. It wasn't a coordinated mutiny. It was just the natural, gravitational pull of eyes shifting to the epicenter of a disaster. And the epicenter was a sweating guy in a bespoke suit and a white coat who had played the role of the undisputed god of that floor all afternoon. A guy who had now crash-landed into that highly specific, agonizing total destruction that doesn't involve any violence. The absolute, humiliating destruction of a tyrant who has been completely exposed by the horrific logic of his own arrogance. A defeat that can't be argued or spun, because it was engineered by his own pathetic bigotry. The monitor kept pinging its steady, mocking rhythm. 72 steady beats, drawing a beautiful green wave on the digital display. Ticking off the seconds. The sound of a multi-millionaire staying alive because a peasant fired for bad optics had kicked the door in anyway. Vance stared down at the breathing VIP on the bed. He dragged his eyes over to the heavy ink choking Luke's arm, staring at the molecular diagram that had been hiding in plain sight all afternoon. The ink that had walked past his office 1,000 times over 4 years. The ink that had been present for every transport, every late-night round, completely invisible to him, the exact same way the waiting room chairs were invisible. When he finally opened his mouth to speak, his voice had completely bled out. The slick corporate authority, the bulletproof certainty, the arrogant fluency of an alpha male who is used to his words acting as law, vaporized. What crawled out of his throat was the pathetic, staggering voice of a man desperately hunting for a script for a nightmare his PR team had never prepped him for. I had no idea. The frantic stutter carried the pathetic fragility of a guy completely abandoning his armor because he just realized he walked into a minefield. Please, I want you to take your job back. No, better. I want you taking a senior position on the trauma response team. You name the salary. With your tactical background, with what you just pulled off in this room, I can easily justify any executive position to the board. A desperate pause, exposing a guy frantically searching his pockets for a bribe big enough to prove he wasn't a monster. And I will. The hospital will fully cover the laser removal for your tattoos, sir, so that your professional image... He choked on the sentence. He heard the words coming out of his own mouth the exact microsecond they hit the air, which is the absolute worst time to realize you are digging your own grave. A slow, dark smile cracked across Luke's face. It wasn't the arrogant smirk of a guy spiking the football. It was the hardest, ugliest kind of smile to look at. The heavy, exhausted, tragic smile of an operator who is absolutely not surprised. A guy who walked into this ambush with the exact right expectations about what he would find. Who predicted the enemy's move perfectly. It was a smile dripping with the cynical, heartbreaking exhaustion of a man who is so violently tired of watching the world repeat the exact same bigoted patterns that it doesn't even make him angry anymore. It just makes him tired. You really didn't learn a damn thing, did you? His voice held that exact same terrifying sub-zero calm that he had weaponized all day. Not forced, but the genuine, unshakable calm of an operator who had run this exact mental simulation 1,000 times. A man who had arrived at a spiritual high ground where he could stare directly into the soul of another man's bigotry with total clarity and pity him for it. My ink isn't the ugly thing in this room that needs to be erased. A brutal, crushing pause that carried the weight of every single afternoon shift over the last 4 years, every single sterile hallway, every single dying patient's hand he had held in the dark. Your bigotry is... Vance opened his mouth, not a single sound came out. Luke reached down and slid the black notebook out of the tactical bag. Not to write a single word, just to grip it with the fierce, protective reflex of a guy confirming his most lethal weapon is still on his person. He slid it back into the pocket. He slung the heavy backpack over his shoulder, with the casual, effortless motion of a man squaring away his gear to walk away, which is exactly what he was doing. I don't want a single dime of your blood money. The words hit the tile floor with the lethal, titanium finality of a verdict that is not open for appeal. I don't want your fancy title. I don't want a single piece of the garbage you're desperately trying to bribe me with because you're terrified of the bomb you just built. He snapped his eyes to the clinical pharmacist. The VIP is going to stabilize, but he needs hyper-aggressive monitoring for the next 12 hours, continuous cardiac telemetry, and a full liver function panel. The pharmacist gave a rapid, terrified nod, locking into the orders with the total submission of a guy taking commands from a god. I just came back for my pen. The heavy fountain pen was sitting on the stainless instrument tray where he had dropped it after slashing out the chemical formula. Luke snatched it off the tray. He slid it into the breast pocket of his blue scrubs with the quiet reverence of a man securing an object that holds massive value, not because of its price tag, but because of the blood it has witnessed. Then he turned and marched toward the glass doors, and there was a new, terrifying frequency radiating off his heavy stride that hadn't been there before. The rhythm of his boots hadn't changed, but the weight of the step had mutated. As he closed the distance to the ICU exit, he moved completely differently than he had all afternoon. It was the untouchable, lethal swagger of an operator who had successfully executed the breach, neutralized the target, and was exfiltrating the hot zone with the icy, unbothered lightness of a man who owes absolutely nothing to anyone in that room. He hit the doors. He stopped. He had one bullet left in the chamber. He didn't even give them the respect of fully turning around. He stood in profile, staring at the glass, the heavy backpack strapped to his massive shoulders, the pen secured in his pocket. And when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into a radically different gear, not heavier, not louder, but infinitely sharper. The lethal precision of a sniper delivering a kill shot engineered to do massive, calculated structural damage. About that for cause termination. A ticking pause. I recorded it. The entire ambush in the hallway this afternoon, including the part right now where you called me a piece of trash in front of your staff. The intel detonated in the trauma bay, carrying that radioactive blast wave that violently reorganizes the entire power dynamic of a room before the echo even dies. It's going to be a highly useful piece of leverage for when I decide to drag this hospital into federal court, or when I decide to hand the audio file over to the press. His dead eyes flicked over his shoulder, locking onto Vance for one final agonizing second. Not with furious rage, but with the cold, dead-eyed apathy of an executioner completely indifferent to the begging of the man he's about to hang. Think about it. He shoved the glass door open, and he walked out. The sterile hospital corridor swallowed the massive man in the faded blue scrubs, with the apathetic, comfortable silence that hallways reserve for the ghosts who have walked them 1,000 times. Luke had paced that exact linoleum floor hundreds of times on the graveyard shift. This was the final lap. There was a vicious, undeniable lightness in his heavy boots that had nothing to do with a spring in his step. It was the profound, soul-clearing lightness of a man who just violently cut a massive anchor off his back that he didn't even realize he was dragging, until he finally watched it sink to the bottom of the ocean. Now I'm asking you, should Luke drag that hospital into federal court and leak the audio to the press, publicly destroying the arrogant suits who tried to ruin his life? Or is he making the ultimate power move by just walking away with a clean conscience, leaving Vance to suffocate under the crushing weight of his own shattered ego? There is no wrong answer. There is only your answer. Drop it in the comments. I want to know exactly what you think. The street outside the fortress was bleeding into that chaotic late afternoon rush hour. Suits power walking, cabs blasting horns, thousands of people violently charging in 100 different directions, fueled by the manic urgency of a city that refuses to stop spinning just because a man almost flatlined 2 floors up. Luke had pushed his way out through the main revolving glass doors. He stopped dead on the concrete corner with the instinctual heavy pause of an operator who just breached a bunker and needs a full 60 seconds to recalibrate his sensors to the open air. He reached into his canvas jacket and pulled out a cigarette that had been waiting in that pocket since sunrise. He hadn't smoked it. He had just kept it holstered, waiting for the exact right moment that the chaotic shift had violently refused to give him. He lit it. He stared up into the burning sky, wearing the exact expression he only allowed himself to wear when he was absolutely sure nobody was watching him expecting a performance. It wasn't the arrogant smirk of a superhero. It wasn't the pathetic scowl of a victim. And it wasn't any of the cheap cardboard stereotypes the hospital had desperately tried to force him to play. It was the raw, unfiltered face of a man carrying a blood-soaked history who had marched through war zones, sterile hospital corridors, and basement locker rooms where you grab your bag for the final time, and had emerged on a dirty concrete corner in the afternoon sun carrying the profound, unshakable wholeness of a guy who refused to let any of those hellholes steal his soul. He pulled the black notebook out of his tactical bag, He flipped to the very next blank page with the automatic hypnotic motion that had defined his entire afternoon. A motion that, as it turns out, defined his entire existence. The physical reflex of an operator who documents the horror because his brain demands the ink, who logs the nightmares because he knows the intel is going to save a life someday, even when the rest of the world has absolutely no idea the book even exists. He scribbled 3 lines, not chemical equations this time, not pharmaceutical dosages, not grid coordinates, just raw words. Written in that tiny, hyper-precise script that had filled decades of leather-bound notebooks with the encrypted log of every single thing in this ugly world that was actually worth remembering. He snapped it shut, shoved it deep into his pocket with the exact same quiet reverence. He took one final heavy drag of the cigarette. He blew a thick cloud of gray smoke into the fading afternoon sun. Then he flicked the cherry onto the asphalt, crushed it out with the heel of his heavy boot, and started walking. The chaotic rush-hour mob swallowed him whole, the exact way a city swallows ghosts who aren't actively screaming for attention, absorbing him, parting around him, and relentlessly moving forward. A massive man in faded blue scrubs with a tactical backpack strapped to his shoulders, heavy ink crawling up his neck, wrapping the intricate scales of dragons, the blooming petals of lotus flowers, and the brutal molecular geometry of a nerve gas antidote. Marching down the concrete on his own terms, fading into the relentless current of 1,000 people who have places to be. An ordinary man, holding a terrifyingly extraordinary history, a history meticulously logged, just like every other nightmare he deemed worthy of surviving, in the pages of a beat-up black notebook tucked inside a faded uniform pocket. This story is cold, hard proof that judging a book by its cover is always a pathetic reflection of the coward doing the judging, never the target. That bigotry is a blindfold you willingly tie around your own eyes, and it always demands its pound of flesh at the most catastrophic possible moment, the exact second the person you threw in the trash is holding the only key to your survival. That raw, god-tier competence never, ever asks for permission to exist. And that true bulletproof dignity isn't a title some arrogant boss hands to you. It's the titanium spine you walk out with when everyone else abandons you in the dark. If you want more stories that rip your heart out and put it back together, smash subscribe and ring the bell to join the crew.